didn't see the fire I walked through, just the smoke it left behind. In a small-town bakery, a quiet, scarred woman becomes the target of ridicule until one unexpected customer recognizes a symbol from a battlefield they both survived. As her past begins to surface, so does a deeper truth about resilience, community, and what it means to be seen for who you truly are. But when old wounds clash with present-day cruelty, what will it take for respect to finally rise? Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if stories of courage move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just change the way you see the world. Annie Garner never liked the way people flinched when they first saw her face. She was used to it by now. The flicker of surprise, the quick turn away, the awkward hush that always followed. The scars stretched from her left ear down to the edge of her jaw, curving like melted wax along the soft line of her neck and disappearing beneath the crisp collar of her baker's coat. Most days she kept her hair tucked behind her ears, preferring honesty over the pretense of hiding. After all, scars were only stories that hadn't been told out loud. Her mornings began when the rest of the town still slept. It was just past 3 when Annie would unlock the back door of the Morning Glory Bakery, her arms loaded with sacks of flour and her mind set for another day. She didn't need an alarm clock. She was hardwired for discipline, for quiet routine, for the peace that came when only her footsteps echoed on the tiled floor. There was comfort in the measured acts of her trade, measuring sugar, sifting flour, mixing, kneading, rolling. The world was simple when all that mattered was dough rising beneath her scarred hands. Inside the bakery, the silence was sacred. Annie moved through the kitchen with the precision of a surgeon, each movement practiced, her fingers nimble despite the taut, shiny skin that puckered at her knuckles. She took pride in the work, the gentle folding of croissant dough, the careful brushing of egg wash, the neat rows of morning buns waiting to be baked. Her scars never slowed her down. If anything, they seemed to drive her forward, demanding that she make something beautiful each morning, if only to prove she still could. Margaret Doyle, the bakery's owner, trusted Annie more than anyone. She knew what it was to be overlooked, to fight for every scrap of respect. When she'd hired Annie 3 years ago, she hadn't asked about the scars or the tightness that sometimes drew Annie's mouth into a hard line. She'd seen only the way Annie handled a rolling pin, the care she took in shaping loaves, the quiet diligence in her eyes. Margaret ran a tight ship, but she'd always made room for people with heavy stories. It was just good business. People with something to prove rarely called in sick. By the time the sun rose, Annie had already pulled 3 batches of bread from the ovens. The kitchen was heavy with the scent of cinnamon, vanilla, and warm yeast. Steam curled against the windows, fogging the glass so thickly that the early light outside turned soft and golden. The world felt far away here, filtered through the haze of heat and sugar. For these few quiet hours, Annie was just a baker, her scars invisible beneath the glow of her work. Lisa Green, the bakery's cashier, would arrive around 6, always with a sleepy smile and a pink thermos clutched in one hand. Lisa had a way of moving through the world as if everything were a private joke, her laughter light and gentle. She never stared at Annie, never hesitated to pass her a mixing bowl or ask for help with the register. If Lisa saw the scars, she pretended not to. For that, Annie was quietly grateful. "Morning, Annie," Lisa called out, her voice muffled by a yawn as she shrugged off her coat. "You beat me here again. That's some kind of record." Annie just smiled, glancing up from the tray of chocolate croissants she was arranging. "Old habits," she said, her voice low but steady. She'd never been much for small talk, but Lisa didn't seem to mind. Margaret swept in not long after, bringing a gust of cold air and the faint scent of gardenias. She made her rounds, checking the ovens, peering over Annie's shoulder to inspect the pastries, nodding with approval. Annie liked the way Margaret ran the bakery. No nonsense, no wasted words, just honest work and the understanding that everyone was fighting their own private battle. As the morning grew brighter, the first customers trickled in, locals mostly, who came for fresh bread and hot coffee on their way to work. Annie stayed behind the counter, half shielded by racks of pastries and a glass display case. She didn't mind being invisible. It was easier that way. She could watch the world without having to be part of it. Tommy Sanders, the foreman of the crew working on the new library down the block, was the kind of man who never missed a chance to be seen. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw, and a swagger that announced itself before he even opened the bakery door. Tommy liked to be the center of attention. He liked to laugh loud and slap his buddies on the back, and every morning he brought his crew into the bakery like a storm front, loud and brash and hungry for trouble. They came in just after 7, boots tracking mud across the floor, voices booming in the small space. Tommy led the way, grinning wide as he surveyed the display case. His crew, Mike Harper and Ben Turner mostly, plus a few others who changed from week to week, fanned out behind him, crowding the counter. "Smells like heaven in here, don't it?" Tommy announced, glancing at his crew with a wink. "Shame you can't bottle that up, huh, boys?" Annie kept her head down, arranging loaves of sourdough on the wooden shelves. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the sense of shrinking into herself, willing her scars to fade. She'd learned that the best way to survive was not to react. Don't give them anything to feed on. Don't show them you care. Lisa stood at the register, her smile strained as she took their orders. Tommy leaned over the counter, peering past Lisa, his eyes landing on Annie. The grin widened. "Hey, morning, Annie," Tommy called out, his tone just a shade too loud. "Got any of those monster cookies today? You know, the ones that look like they survived a house fire?" The laughter from his crew was sharp, cutting through the soft background music. Annie's hands froze for half a second, then resumed their careful work. She didn't answer. Lisa's jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything, just punched buttons on the register. "Don't mind Tommy," Ben chimed in, a mocking lilt in his voice. "He's just jealous he can't bake to save his life." Tommy laughed, slapping Ben on the shoulder. "Ain't that the truth? Hey, Annie, you ever think about going into business with us? Bet you could start a barbecue joint. Just stand close to the grill and scare the meat right off the bone." More laughter. Annie felt the heat rising up her neck, her scars burning. She focused on the bread, arranging each loaf as if it were a shield. She'd survived worse than words, she reminded herself. She'd survived fire, pain, the long, empty months in the hospital when her own mother couldn't look her in the eye. She could survive this, too. Margaret appeared at her side, silent and stern. She fixed Tommy with a look that could freeze boiling water. "If you boys are done, maybe let Annie work in peace, or take your business somewhere else." Tommy just grinned, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Just having a little fun, Miss Doyle. No harm meant." He dropped a few bills on the counter, grabbed his coffee and pastries and swaggered out, his crew trailing behind him. The door swung shut and the bakery felt smaller, quieter. Lisa glanced over at Annie, her eyes worried. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Annie nodded, though her throat felt tight. "It's just noise," she said, trying to make it true. But even as she said it, she knew the words would follow her all day. They always did. Once the morning rush passed, the bakery settled into a slower rhythm. Margaret retreated to her office, and Lisa disappeared to restock napkins in the front. Annie was left alone with her bread, her thoughts, and the hush that settled after a storm. She leaned against the counter, letting herself breathe for a moment. In the quiet, she remembered a different kitchen. A field tent filled with dust and noise, the slap of her boots on sandbags, the smell of oil and gunpowder. She remembered the weight of her uniform, the steady beat of her heart as she handled explosives with the same care she now gave to kneading dough. It felt like a different life, one she kept locked away inside herself, hidden behind scars and silence. She pressed her palm to her arm, just below her elbow, where the faded ink of her old unit tattoo lay beneath her sleeve. It was a private reminder, a secret bit of bravery no one in this town had ever asked about. The bakery door chimed, breaking her reverie. Annie glanced up and saw a new face, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, a little older than her, with the posture of someone who still stood at attention, even off-duty. He lingered by the display case, taking in the pastries, the bread, the woman behind the counter. He didn't stare at Annie's scars. He simply nodded at her, quiet and respectful, as if he understood the weight of silence. Annie went back to her work, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know it yet, but something had shifted in the air. Some small change she couldn't name. For the rest of the morning, Annie worked in the steam and shadows, letting the rhythms of baking anchor her. In her world, scars were part of the story, but sometimes she wondered if anyone would ever care to listen. The morning after always seemed worse, not because the insults got crueler, but because Annie Garner could never quite shake them off before sunrise. There was a heaviness that settled over her as soon as the first boot scraped across the threshold of Morning Glory Bakery. As certain as the oven's heat and the rattle of mixing bowls, she felt it in the way her fingers tightened around the bread peel, in the wary glances of the early risers waiting for their coffee, and in the brittle hush that fell whenever the construction crew's laughter echoed through the storefront. It began the moment Tommy Sanders returned, leading his pack with that swagger that turned a simple walk into a performance. He held the door for no one, shouldering his way inside, his boots still crusted with dried clay from the worksite. Mike Harper and Ben Turner were just steps behind, each carrying the easy arrogance of men who felt at home wherever they went. Their voices swelled to fill the space, driving out any hint of the gentle music that usually played over the speakers. Annie caught their arrival out of the corner of her eye. She tried to keep her focus on the sourdough loaves cooling on the rack, her back straight, her hands moving automatically. She told herself she didn't mind being invisible, that it was better to blend into the background. Yet every morning, Tommy found a way to remind her she was impossible to ignore. "Morning, sunshine," he called across the counter, making sure everyone could hear. "Heard you're the only one in town who can bake bread tough enough for construction men." Mike snickered, elbowing Ben. "Bet that's why the crust is so thick." "Takes a tough hand to do that, huh, Annie?" Annie didn't answer. She lined up the loaves, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to the next task, which was slicing cinnamon swirl bread for the day's orders. There was something sacred about the repetition. Cut, stack, wrap, repeat. She tried to let it drown out the taunts, but the laughter always found a way through, threading itself between the sound of knives and the chime of the cash register. Lisa Green, standing at the till, gave Tommy a tight, perfunctory smile. "You want the usual, Tommy?" He looked her over with the practiced ease of a man who never considered a woman more than scenery. "Yeah, Lisa, but make it extra strong today. To wake me up after this town's excitement." He turned back to his crew, lowering his voice just enough so only those closest could hear, but that included Annie. "Bet Annie here never needs caffeine, probably wired already with all that extra voltage." Ben laughed, and Mike cackled. "Careful, man. You don't want to get zapped." The words skittered along Annie's nerves, needling at old wounds that never quite closed. She tightened her grip on the bread knife. For a moment she imagined saying something sharp, something that would make Tommy blink and back off. But the urge faded as quickly as it had come. She'd learned long ago, first in the field, then in the hospital, then in kitchens like this one, that sometimes survival was about silence, not defiance. Margaret Doyle appeared at the kitchen door, her gaze sweeping over the crew like a broom. "You boys find your manners yet, or should I check the lost and found?" Tommy flashed his most innocent grin, all charm and white teeth. "Wouldn't dream of causing trouble, Miss Doyle. We just like a little conversation with our breakfast." Margaret didn't bother replying. She crossed her arms and watched until the order was ready, then handed out pastries with deliberate care, her back straight, her eyes steady. Tommy met her stare, but only for a moment before looking away. There was a line Margaret didn't need to say out loud. Even men like Tommy respected her enough to know when to retreat. Once the construction crew settled into a corner booth, their noise receded into background static, mixing with a clink of mugs and the soft shuffle of customers at the door. Annie took the opportunity to slip into the kitchen, carrying a tray of muffins that needed to cool. The back room was warmer than the storefront, the air thick with the scent of melted butter and sugar. Here the world narrowed to the rhythm of her own breath and the low hum of the ovens. But even in the kitchen, the echoes of the morning found her. Annie closed her eyes, pressing the heels of her hands to her brow, willing herself to focus on the next batch of dough. It was never just the jokes themselves, but the way they reminded her how quickly people reduced her to a curiosity, or worse, a warning. She sometimes wondered if they imagined she hadn't heard, or if they simply didn't care. Either way, the ache lingered. A soft knock sounded at the kitchen door. Lisa peeked inside, her expression gentle. "Hey, you need a hand?" Annie shook her head, a tiny grateful smile lifting the corner of her mouth. "I'm good, just need a second." Lisa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Don't listen to them. They're idiots. Everybody here knows you're the reason this place is still open. Margaret would lose her mind without you." Annie shrugged, letting the compliment settle somewhere deep where she could hold on to it later. "Doesn't bother me." Lisa eyed her, unconvinced. "You say that every day, and every day it bothers you." Annie didn't answer. Instead, she scooped a tray of scones from the oven and set them out to cool, letting the simple act of baking become her anchor again. Lisa watched her for a moment longer, then returned to the front, her soft laughter drifting behind her like a benediction. Alone again, Annie glanced at her reflection in the stainless steel fridge door. The scars on her face glowed dully in the fluorescent light, less angry than they once were, but still unignorable. She traced a finger along the line that curved beneath her jaw, remembering a night that smelled of diesel and blood, a deafening blast, the slow crawl back to consciousness. She'd been called a hero once, back when her uniform still fit and people saluted her in passing. Now she was the baker people whispered about, the one who must have a story, the one they pitied or teased, depending on their own cruelties. She rolled her shoulders, let out a slow breath, and checked the clock. Almost time for the next rush. Annie squared her spine, smoothing her apron, and returned to the front, her face set in the careful mask she'd perfected. By mid-morning, the bakery was humming with the sound of customers. Teachers from the elementary school gathered at a corner table, grading papers over sticky buns. A retired couple sat in their usual spot by the window, sipping coffee and trading sections of the morning paper. Annie stayed mostly behind the counter, assembling orders, sliding paper bags across the polished wood. She knew most of the regulars by name, their favorite pastries, their quirks, the way they liked their coffee. Some would meet her gaze, offer a smile, a brief nod, nothing more. Others couldn't help but stare a second too long before looking away, ashamed at their own curiosity. The construction crew lingered, their laughter punctuating the low murmur of the shop. Tommy drummed his fingers on the table, glancing over every so often, as if waiting for a reaction that never came. Annie pretended not to notice. She wiped the counters, restocked napkins, made herself small in the corner of the kitchen when she could. But even she couldn't escape completely. As she passed by with a tray of clean mugs, Tommy reached out, tapping the counter. "Hey, Annie," he said, voice too casual. "You ever think about getting those scars fixed? I know a guy, plastic surgeon, does miracles, they say." Mike snorted. Yeah, she could be the poster girl for before and after shots. Ben laughed, the sound sharp and mean. For the briefest second, Annie met Tommy's eyes. There was something there. Pride, maybe, or the simple thrill of power. She said nothing, just held his gaze until he looked away first, Then she turned on her heel, moving to the back room, her heart thudding in her chest. Behind the counter, Lisa glared at the crew. "That's enough, Tommy." He just shrugged, smirking. "Can't take a joke. Maybe this job's too tough for her." Lisa's reply was swift. "At least she works for a living, which is more than I can say for some." The retort earned her a round of laughter, but this time it felt different, less cruel, more like bravado. Lisa stood tall, her eyes daring Tommy to push further. After a beat, he leaned back, raising his hands. All right. Didn't mean anything by it." Lisa didn't answer. She just watched them until they turned their attention elsewhere. In the safety of the kitchen, Annie let herself breathe again. She leaned against the counter, closing her eyes for a moment, wishing she could simply disappear into the flour and sugar. But that wasn't how life worked, and she knew it better than most. She straightened, wiping her hands and returning to her work. For every cruel morning, there was the promise of bread rising in the oven, of the quiet satisfaction that came with a job done well. Annie held on to that, letting it carry her through the day, even as the world outside tried to remind her of everything she'd lost. She would not let them take away what she had left. Some wounds take root so deeply they echo through every new day, flaring at the most unexpected moments. For Annie Garner, the low hum of the bakery, the scents of bread and coffee, sometimes slipped away and were replaced by a memory. A flash of uniform green, the taste of grit on her tongue, the metallic stench of adrenaline thick in the air. She never planned the way these moments arrived. They simply happened, breaking into her routine, as if to remind her she was more than the sum of scars on her skin. It always started the same way. She would be halfway through folding dough or rolling out pie crust, and suddenly she was somewhere else. Instead of the gentle warmth of the ovens, she'd feel the oppressive heat of an overseas desert. The kitchen's fluorescent lights blurred into the too bright sun, the rhythmic hiss of steam replaced by the hard rattle of gunfire or the anxious crackle of a radio. Most days, she could blink away the memories, anchor herself with the sound of her name called from the front, or the thud of a heavy baking pan. But other times, she was pulled fully back into the life she'd lived before Morning Glory Bakery, when her last name had been stitched above her heart, when every day was a question of survival. Back then, Annie had been Specialist Garner, part of an Army EOD unit, a bomb squad, sent to make roads safe, buildings secure, and lives a little less fragile. Her hands, now so practiced at shaping bread, had once been trained to diffuse nightmares. She remembered the endless checks and double checks, the tense moments as her team waited for her call, the odd comfort she took in the sameness of military ritual. Even then, she had been quiet, focused, the one people trusted when things got complicated. She hadn't been born for danger, but she'd learned to carry it. Some part of her had always known that discipline, when forged in necessity, could become a shield. There had been camaraderie, laughter, and purpose, things that vanished in the years since. She could picture faces and voices still. Sam, the wisecracking team leader who always smuggled chocolate in his vest. Torres, who sang old country songs as they drove dusty convoys. Diaz, whose shy smile could ease the worst tension. They were more than colleagues, they were family. They saw her, really saw her, long before scars claimed her fate. No one cared that she was quiet, or that her hands sometimes shook after a mission. Out there, trust was everything. Annie had never let them down. It happened on a day like any other. An assignment, a routine sweep, one more task in a long list. They joked about coffee and the latest country song on the radio. Then everything went wrong in the blink of an eye. Annie remembered the sharp snap of static, the hollow thump beneath her boots, the sudden eruption of earth and heat and noise. The details came in fragments, a flash of orange, the jolt of being thrown sideways, the desperate, distant shouts as someone dragged her to cover. She remembered the taste of blood, the white-hot pain that seared through her left side, the blur of shapes as medics worked over her. Her ears rang for days after, as if the blast had shaken the world itself apart. After that, the hospital days bled together. White ceilings, bright lights, voices muffled by morphine. She drifted in and out, measuring time by the nurse's visits and the slow tick of the clock on the wall. Every morning someone would unwrap her bandages, check her wounds, and chart her progress. She caught glimpses of herself in the polished steel of hospital carts, swollen, burned, half her face lost beneath angry lines and tight, shiny skin. At first, she turned away, unwilling to see what had become of her, but little by little, she learned to look, to accept that the reflection was hers, that survival sometimes meant learning to live with the aftermath. Her team visited when they could, always carrying pieces of the world outside, a letter, a bag of her favorite trail mix, a photo of the sunrise over base. Sam joked that he would start wearing scars to match hers, just so they could stay coordinated. It helped, for a while. But the hardest days were the quiet ones, when she was left alone with her thoughts. She tried to remember every step, every choice, every moment that led to the blast. Could she have done something differently? Should she have caught the trigger? The questions haunted her, even after the doctors called her a hero for saving the squad, even after they told her she'd likely never serve again. Rehab was slow, painful. She learned to move again, to stretch skin that didn't want to stretch, to hold a pen, to pick up a cup, to sign her own name on the endless forms that came with discharge. Every step forward felt like proof that she belonged somewhere, even if she didn't know where that would be. The Army called it transitioning to civilian life, as if changing uniforms meant you could leave behind everything else. But Annie knew better. The ache was deeper than the scars. Her mother picked her up from the rehab center, silent most of the drive home. There was pride in her eyes, but something else, too, a sadness that settled in the car like a shadow. At home, neighbors left casseroles and cards on the porch, but few knocked. Annie felt their curiosity, their pity, the sideways glances that lingered a beat too long. She kept mostly to herself, filling the days with small errands and long walks, trying to find a new purpose. She learned to cook, to measure, to bake, to knead. In the kitchen, her hands found comfort in repetition. It was the closest she came to feeling steady. When she moved to this town, the scars were less raw, the pain less sharp. She found Morning Glory Bakery through a help wanted sign, the promise of quiet hours and honest work too good to ignore. Margaret Doyle had interviewed her with kindness, but never pity. She asked about Annie's experience, her reliability, her willingness to learn. Not once did she mention the scars. By the end of the interview, Margaret offered her the job. Annie accepted before fear could change her mind. Working in the bakery gave her a rhythm. The early morning suited her, the solitude a kind of balm. She learned to read the dough, to time the proofs, to coax the best from every batch. The town, for the most part, was content to let her be. A few whispered, some stared, but Annie learned to look past it. She built a life on small victories, perfect loaves, a satisfied customer, the smile Lisa gave her each morning. But there were still days when memories broke through, when the clang of a dropped pan or the rumble of construction outside sent her heart racing. She wore her scars openly, refusing to hide, but the past was never far behind. Sometimes, in the hush of the kitchen before dawn, Annie would rest her fingers on the faded tattoo beneath her sleeve, tracing the letters and numbers that marked her as one of the few who'd served, who'd come home changed. It was her secret, her comfort, a reminder that she'd belonged somewhere once. Not even Lisa knew the story, not the truth of it, not the reason Annie always flinched at loud noises or why she never took time off around the 4th of July. She preferred it that way. Some parts of her life felt too fragile to share, even with those who meant well. In the bakery, though, Annie built something new every day. Each loaf, each pastry was a step forward, a silent promise that she was more than her scars. When Tommy and his crew made their daily rounds, she let their words wash over her, knowing they couldn't touch the part of her that survived worse than cruelty. She was still learning what it meant to live again, but each day she felt a little steadier on her feet. Sometimes, late at night, Annie would sit by her window, the tattoo visible on her forearm in the moonlight. She would remember the friends she'd lost, the laughter, the camaraderie, the fire and pain, and, finally, the strange, quiet peace that followed. There was sadness, yes, but also a flicker of pride. A sense that she had carried her burden, and it had not broken her. In the heart of the bakery, Annie found a place for herself, a way to keep moving forward. And though echoes of the past still lingered, she knew, deep down, that her story was not finished yet. The first time Daniel Brooks stepped into Morning Glory Bakery, he did so without expectation. He was just another traveler passing through the quiet streets of Fairview, the kind of town where people still waved from porches and gas stations had handwritten signs in the windows. His truck, a dust-covered Chevy that had seen more war zones than car washes, sat cooling at the curb outside. Daniel had planned only to grab a coffee, maybe something warm to eat before heading out toward a VA appointment 2 towns over. But as soon as the door opened, the scent of butter and cinnamon stopped him in his tracks. He paused just inside the doorway, letting the warmth wash over him. The place was small, the kind of cozy setup he'd always appreciated. Worn wooden floors, brass pendant lights dangling above a long pastry case, and tables arranged like someone had thought more about conversation than design. The bell above the door jingled once more as it settled behind him, but the shop remained busy in its own gentle way. A few regulars occupied the tables near the window, and 2 women chatted quietly in the corner with open laptops and untouched muffins. Daniel moved toward the counter, taking stock of the glass case. Rows of pastries gleamed under the warm light. Scones, croissants, fruit danishes, and what looked like a whole loaf section off to one side. Behind the counter, a young woman with a ponytail and a bright pink apron handled the register. Her eyes met his with polite curiosity. "Morning," she greeted. "Can I get you something?" "Use coffee for now," Daniel said, voice gravelly from hours on the road. "Black." She nodded and turned to grab a mug. While he waited, Daniel scanned the kitchen behind her. It was then that he saw her. A woman stood at the prep counter, rolling dough with mechanical precision, her body half turned away from him. She was tall, lean, and the way people are when they've carried weight they don't talk about. Her hair was pulled back in a low knot, and her profile showed the pale sheen of old burn scars trailing from her left temple down to her neck. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and as she reached to adjust a pan on the rack beside her, her right forearm shifted just enough for the hem of her sleeve to ride up. Daniel's breath caught. There it was. Ink, faded with time, but unmistakable. A bomb disposal unit tattoo, the same design his own team used when they were stationed outside Kabul. A coiled serpent wrapped around a diffused IED. Latin script curved beneath it. Noli me tangere. Do not touch me. He hadn't seen that mark in years, not since his last tour, not since the explosion that ended his career and left a crater in more than just the earth. Daniel blinked, unsure if he was imagining it. He stepped slightly to the side, just enough to get a better angle, but not so much as to be noticed. The woman didn't look up. Her hands moved with the kind of confidence born from years of repetition. Strong, steady, sure. "Here you go," the cashier said, setting the mug down on the counter. Daniel took it, but his attention remained fixed on the woman behind the prep station. His mind, once dulled by fatigue, was suddenly alert. "Who's the baker?" he asked, his voice low, casual. The cashier blinked. "That's Annie. She runs the kitchen. Been here a few years now." The name didn't ring any immediate bells, but then again, many soldiers kept things close. Names were swapped for nicknames or call signs, and people changed over time. Still, there was something in her posture, something familiar in the way she moved. Daniel wasn't the type to believe in coincidences, especially when it came to Unit Inc. He sipped the coffee. It was strong, dark, just the way he liked it. "Tell her the coffee's good," he said, nodding toward the kitchen, "and that it's rare to find a steady hand these days." The cashier smiled, half in confusion, half in kindness. "I'll let her know." Daniel took a seat near the window, close enough to keep her in view but far enough to not draw attention. He didn't want to spook her. He knew what it was to walk through the world like a ghost, how exhausting it was to be looked at too closely, or not at all. So he waited, nursing the coffee, letting the warmth seep into his hands as he studied the room. Annie didn't glance his way once. She stayed focused on her task, moving through the bakery with practiced precision. But Daniel noticed small things, the way she checked every timer twice, the subtle stiffness in her left shoulder as she lifted trays, the way she used her body to keep her scars turned just slightly away from view, not hiding, just managing space. He understood that dance all too well. At one point, a tall man with a construction vest swaggered in with a small crew, their boots thudding across the floor like they owned it. They laughed too loud, stood too close to the counter, and made a point of drawing attention. Daniel watched the interaction with a tightening jaw. One of them, tall, thick around the shoulders, made a crude remark loud enough to carry. Daniel's gaze snapped to Annie. She didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She just went on slicing a loaf of rye as if nothing had happened. But Daniel saw the way her grip shifted on the bread knife, how her shoulders pulled inward, ever so slightly. The tension was brief but unmistakable. He'd seen that same expression in mess halls and base tents, women who endured because they had to, because drawing attention to cruelty sometimes made it worse. His fingers tapped against the ceramic of his coffee mug, a habit left over from patrols. Eventually the loud men left and the room settled again. Daniel stood, finished his coffee, and approached the counter for a refill. Annie had just placed a new tray of baguettes behind the display when their eyes finally met. She didn't smile. She didn't look away either. Her gaze was cool, guarded, but something flickered there. Curiosity, perhaps, or the quiet awareness of someone who'd been noticed more times than she wanted. "Coffee's solid," Daniel said, nodding slightly. "Glad you liked it," she replied, voice even. "I couldn't help but notice your ink," he said, his tone respectful. "Unit tattoo. Bomb disposal?" There was a beat of silence. Not long, but it felt heavy, like a held breath between them. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "You know that tattoo?" "I wore the same one," he said. "Different team? Different war. But same snake, same motto." She looked at him fully then, no longer trying to mask the scars or steer the conversation elsewhere. "Where?" "Southern Afghanistan, 2011 to 2015. Army. EOD." Another silence followed, but this one was softer, less cautious. "Fallujah," she said quietly. "Army, 2009, pulled out in 10. Daniel gave a low whistle. "Tough place." "You're not wrong." He extended his hand. "Daniel Brooks." She hesitated for half a second before reaching out. "Annie Garner." Their hands met briefly. Hers was strong, calloused in places, warm from the oven. She didn't smile, but there was a shift in her eyes, something warmer, something old and familiar, like the sound of a shared language. "I'll be around a few days," Daniel said. "VA down the highway. Might stop in again, if that's all right." Annie nodded once. "We open at 4. First batch comes out by 5. "I'll be here," he said, tipping his head slightly. Then he left, walking back into the cool morning air. Inside the bakery, Annie turned back to her station, but her hands moved slower now. Not cautious, just thoughtful. For the first time in years, someone had seen more than just the scars. And even if she wouldn't admit it aloud, that quiet recognition felt like the start of something she hadn't expected. Being understood. The next morning, Daniel Brooks was there before the door, unlocked. He stood outside the bakery in the pre-dawn haze, arms crossed, his breath fogging faintly in the crisp air. The streets were still quiet, just the distant hum of a delivery truck and the soft crackle of leaves underfoot. Morning Glory Bakery looked as it always did at that hour, dim lights glowing from within, condensation clinging to the windows, the ghostly silhouettes of ovens already at work, and behind that steamed glass, moving like clockwork, was Annie Garner. She opened the door just after 4, same as always. She didn't jump when she saw him, didn't ask why he was there so early. She only gave him a long, unreadable look and stepped aside so he could enter. "Coffee's not ready yet," she said, already turning toward the back. "That's all right," Daniel replied. "Didn't come for the coffee today." He followed her inside, past the empty tables, the clean counters, into the heart of the bakery. The kitchen was alive with warmth and movement. Trays of dough already rising beneath damp towels, the soft tick of timers, flour dusting the air like smoke. Annie didn't offer him a stool or a chair. She didn't need to. Daniel leaned against the wall near the prep counter, arms folded again, watching the way her hands moved, efficient, practiced, steady. She was shaping loaves, the dough folding beneath her fingers like muscle memory. He let the silence stretch between them. "You knew someone with that tattoo?" she asked finally, her voice low. "I wore that tattoo," he said. "Same design, different unit, but the same motto." Annie gave a brief nod. "I haven't seen anyone with it in years. Most people don't even know what it means." "They usually don't," he agreed. "Only those who've been close enough to the heat to care." She didn't respond right away. Her hands moved faster, slicing dough into precise portions, dusting each piece with flour. Then, quietly, "I stopped talking about it a long time ago." Daniel didn't move. "I figured. It wasn't shame," she added, sharper now. "People always think that. They see the scars and they assume I'm hiding. But it's not shame. It's just people ask the wrong questions. They want the version that makes them feel better." "I know," he said gently. "They want the movie version, a clean story, beginning, middle, and end." Annie looked up at him then, eyes searching. There was no clean end. There was fire and screaming, and then I woke up in a hospital bed with skin I didn't recognize. There's no neat ending to that. Daniel nodded. "I never had an explosion that touched me like that. But I've seen what they leave behind. I've stood too close to the edge." He didn't offer sympathy. She could see it in the way he held himself. This wasn't pity, it was recognition. And that difference mattered more than she could explain. She reached for a new tray, setting it down between them. "I had a name once. In my unit, they called me Whisper, because I never talked unless I had to. But I never missed a wire, never misread a pattern." Daniel let out a low breath. "Whisper. That's a good one. I was good at what I did," she continued, her voice steadier now. "I still think about it sometimes, how it felt to be needed like that. There was clarity in it. You either got it right or people died. It made everything simple." He stepped a little closer, his voice softer now. "And when it's over, nothing feels simple anymore." Annie looked down at her hands. "Exactly." For a while neither of them spoke. Outside, the first hints of daylight began to color the windows pale gold. The smell of rising dough filled the space, mingled with the faint scent of cinnamon and butter. It was the kind of silence that felt earned. Daniel shifted his weight. You ever talk to your old team? She shook her head. Some of them reached out after the hospital, sent cards. A few called. I never picked up. I didn't want them to see me like this. I didn't want to be a footnote in their stories. You're not a footnote, he said firmly. You were part of something. You still are. Annie glanced over, eyes narrowing just slightly. Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like to walk into a room and have people stop talking, or to have some drunk idiot at a bar ask if the fire was your fault. You don't know what it's like to have your whole identity tied up in what happened to you. I do, Daniel said. Just not with scars people can see. That stopped her. She looked at him again. Really looked this time. There were no burns on his face, no obvious wounds. But there was a weight in his eyes, the kind of heaviness that didn't go away with rest, the kind that lived behind the ribs. What happened? She asked, her voice softer. IED took out our lead vehicle, he said. I was in the second. My buddy, Staff Sergeant Knox, he was inside the first. I saw it go up, couldn't do anything. Spent the next 2 years wondering why it wasn't me. Annie swallowed. Did you ever stop asking? Not really, he said, but I learned to live with the asking. They stood in silence again, the kind that was no longer empty but full of understanding. The timer buzzed on the oven. Annie moved to it, pulling out a tray of golden, perfectly risen bread. She set it down, steam curling into the air. You're the first person who's asked about the tattoo without making it weird, she said. I'm not here to make anything weird, Daniel replied. I'm just here. And he glanced at him, and tomorrow. I'll probably be here again. Her lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. You keep showing up, you're going to start getting put to work. He chuckled. Wouldn't be the worst thing. I make a mean dish pit assistant. And he picked up a loaf, cradling it like something precious. You can stay, but you don't get to pity me. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime. I'm not here for pity, he said, meeting her gaze. I'm here because sometimes it helps to remember we're not alone in the aftermath. She paused, then gave a small nod. All right, then. Just as the first rays of sunlight broke across the street, Lisa walked in through the front, rubbing sleep from her eyes and pausing when she saw the two of them. Randy sat at the table, eyeing them both. Well, this is new, she said with a raised brow. Annie actually talking to someone before 6? Annie turned back to her dough, but this time there was something different in her posture, less guarded, more open. This is Daniel, she said simply. He knows the language. Lisa blinked. Okay. Hi, Daniel. Daniel smiled. Morning. Annie handed him a cloth and a tray. You want to help, vet? Start there. He took it without question, falling in step beside her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own space. For the first time, the silence between her and someone else didn't feel like a wall, but like a doorway. By the end of the week, Daniel Brooks had become as much a fixture at Morning Glory Bakery as the smell of cinnamon or the quiet clatter of metal trays. He didn't ask for much, just coffee, sometimes a breakfast bun, and always a job to do. Annie let him wash dishes, carry flour bags, wipe down counters. She didn't say much about it, but she didn't stop him either. In a place where people usually kept their distance, Daniel filled a kind of gap she hadn't realized was there. He moved like someone who understood what silence meant, not avoidance, not coldness, just space. Respect. They didn't talk about war every day, but it hung between them in the unspoken way they stacked trays or tied boxes with twine. He was one of the only people who didn't flinch when Annie turned her head, who never once stared at the scars that crawled along her cheek and down her throat. Others noticed him too. Lisa took to calling him early shift backup, joking that he had better attendance than the regulars. Margaret raised a curious brow when he showed up the third morning in a row, but said nothing. If anything, she seemed to understand that Annie had drawn a line around herself, and that Daniel was one of the few she'd let step inside it. But not everyone was pleased. Tommy Sanders didn't like new faces, especially ones that didn't play his game. The following Monday, he walked in with his usual swagger, trailing mud from his boots and a chip on his shoulder. His crew followed close behind, Ben and Mike smirking as they leaned on the counter. "Well, look who's behind enemy lines," Tommy said, loud enough for the whole shop to hear. "Didn't know we had a veterans reunion going on in here." Daniel didn't look up from where he was rinsing a tray at the sink. Annie, standing by the register, stayed perfectly still. Tommy tapped the glass case with one finger. "How about a special today? Something with a little extra burn to it, just like our favorite baker's style." The laugh that followed was too loud, sharp like a broken edge. Annie's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Daniel dried his hands, set the towel down slowly, and stepped forward. "You know," he said calmly, "it's funny. I used to work with guys like you. Loud, useless, always the first to crack when things got tough." Tommy's grin faltered for a split second. "I'm just messing around, buddy. No need to get all wound up." Daniel kept his voice level. "You're not messing around. You're a grown man trying to act tough by insulting a woman who could teach you what real bravery looks like." The bakery had gone silent. Even Lisa froze behind the espresso machine. "What?" Annie stepped forward, not looking at Tommy but at Daniel. "It's fine," she murmured. "You don't have to." "I do," Daniel interrupted gently, not taking his eyes off Tommy. "Because men like this count on people like us staying quiet." Tommy laughed again, but it was thinner now. "Oh, come on. What's she, your charity project?" Annie turned her head then, fully, scars and all, and locked eyes with Tommy. "You want to know something?" she said, her voice low but clear. "That tattoo you saw on my arm? That snake wrapped around the bomb? That's from Fallujah. I was EOD. I disarmed live explosives in buildings smaller than this bakery. One day, one went off before I was done. That's why my face looks like this. But you know what? Everyone else walked away that day because I was the one who stayed." Tommy blinked, taken off guard. Annie didn't stop. "You think it's funny to joke about fire? About pain? You don't know the first thing about sacrifice. You don't know what it's like to be torn apart and still wake up the next day and do something decent with what's left." The entire bakery had gone still, a quiet reverence taking hold. The couple near the window had stopped mid-bite. Lisa was frozen behind the counter, one hand resting on the espresso lever. Even Margaret had stepped out from her office, her eyes locked on Annie. "I didn't come here for pity," Annie said, her voice steady now. "I came here to work, to start over, and if you can't respect that, you can take your pastry order and shove it." There was a long silence. Tommy's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked to his crew for backup, but even Ben and Mike had lost their usual smirks. Daniel stepped beside Annie, not in front of her, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder. "You done?" Daniel asked Tommy. Tommy looked around, suddenly aware of every pair of eyes in the room. "Yeah," he muttered. "We're done." He turned and walked out, the bell over the door ringing sharp as a slap. His crew trailed after him, quieter than usual. As the door shut, a breath seemed to release across the bakery. Then someone clapped. It started from the corner. An older man Annie only knew as Mr. Davies, who came in every Thursday for lemon loaf. His clap was slow, deliberate. Then a teacher from the high school joined in. Then another customer. And another. Before long, the whole shop was applauding. Annie stood there, frozen, the heat rising in her cheeks, but not from shame. She glanced at Daniel, who nodded once, silent approval in his eyes. Margaret stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Annie's shoulder. "You should have said something sooner," she said softly. Annie's voice was quiet. "I didn't think anyone wanted to hear it." "Well, we did," Margaret replied. "We always did." Officer Sam Riley came through the door not long after, responding to a report of a disturbance. Margaret quickly filled him in, and instead of taking notes, he simply tipped his hat to Annie. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," he said, voice firm, "and for keeping calm when others didn't." Annie didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. As the crowd thinned and normal rhythm returned, Annie stepped back into the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she reached for the next tray. Daniel followed, handing her a glass of water. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think so. Maybe." "You were brilliant." She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I never thought I'd say any of that. Not out loud." Daniel smiled. "Sometimes the truth has to be spoken. Not for them, for us." She met his eyes and for the first time in a long while smiled back. Small, but real. Outside, the sun had fully risen, casting golden light through the front windows. And inside Morning Glory Bakery, something had shifted, not just in how people saw Annie, but in how she saw herself. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt seen. A week passed, then another, and something about the town of Fairview began to feel different. Not in any grand, cinematic way. There were no parades, no banners stretched across Main Street, no dramatic changes that made the front page of the town paper. But there was a shift. Subtle, warm. The kind of shift you only noticed because the air around you felt lighter. The change began with the customers. They came in earlier now. Some lingered longer. A retired firefighter named Hank started bringing his granddaughter on Thursdays just for Annie's blueberry muffins. A high school art teacher left a hand-painted mug on the counter with Annie's name on it, claiming it was payment for the best cinnamon roll in 3 counties. Even the mayor's wife stopped in one morning just to shake Annie's hand, calling her an unspoken hero. Annie didn't quite know what to make of it at first. All she'd done was tell the truth, her truth, after years of hiding behind silence and pastry counters. She hadn't expected applause or attention. In fact, she'd braced herself for pity, for people treating her like a wounded thing, fragile and tragic. But what came was different. Not pity, not hero worship, just kindness. A kind of quiet respect. Daniel showed up every day, same time, same table, like clockwork. He still helped when she let him, stacking flour bags, bussing tables, tying ribbons around pastry boxes when the morning rush left Lisa breathless. But more than the help, it was his presence that mattered. The way he asked about the dough, not the scars. The way he told stories, funny ones, sad ones, small ones, without ever pressing for hers. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the bakery and the last customer left with a hot apple tart tucked under one arm, Annie stood by the window, wiping down a table. Daniel sat nearby, sipping the last of his coffee, his worn boots stretched out beneath the chair. "You ever think of opening your own place?" he asked casually, not looking up. She blinked. "This is my place." Daniel grinned. "You know what I mean, a bigger place. Somewhere that says Annie Garner on the door. Maybe even a spot for veterans. A kitchen where they can work, heal, find a rhythm." Annie turned back to the window, watching the light settle over the quiet street. For a long time she'd lived moment to moment, day to day, just surviving. But now something stirred in her chest. A possibility. A pulse. "I don't know," she said. "It used to be enough just to make it through the morning. I never thought past that." "Well," Daniel said, rising from his chair, Maybe it's time to start thinking past it. Later that week, Margaret called a staff meeting. Lisa groaned, expecting the usual talk about holiday hours or inventory. But Margaret had something else in mind. "I've decided to step back," she said plainly, standing in front of the kitchen where she'd spent the last 20 years. "Not retire, exactly, but scale down. And I've already spoken to the bank. I want Annie to take over the bakery." Silence filled the room. Annie looked up from where she'd been prepping dough, stunned. "You what?" Margaret smiled. "You heard me. You already run the place. Might as well make it official." Lisa let out a small whoop of joy, clapping her flour-dusted hands together. Daniel, standing by the sink, simply gave Annie a nod. No surprise in his eyes, only quiet pride. Annie stared at Margaret, words failing her for a long, breathless moment. "Why me?" "Because this place needs a heart," Margaret said, "and you've been giving it one since the day you walked in." The transfer took a few weeks to sort. Paperwork, permits, meetings with lawyers, but the entire town watched it happen with a kind of collective joy. Local businesses donated supplies. A group of veterans from the next county over offered to help repaint the sign. Lisa recruited high school art students to design a mural for the sidewall, an explosion of wheat, flour, and sun, with a coiled serpent hidden in the background, curling protectively around a bread loaf. Annie renamed the shop quietly, just a small brass plaque beside the door that read, "Whispers Bread." Most people didn't ask what it meant, but a few did, and when they did, Annie told them. Not everything, but enough. Tommy Sanders and his crew didn't show up again. Not once. The gossip around town said Officer Riley had a quiet word with Tommy's boss about conduct unbecoming of a contractor. And just like that, the foreman was reassigned to a different site 3 counties away. Annie never saw them again, and she didn't miss them. Instead, new faces filled the bakery, some with uniforms, some with prosthetics, some with stories in their eyes that Annie recognized. She hired a young Marine named Kelly to work part-time in the kitchen, hired a Navy vet to help with early morning prep. Daniel took over organizing Saturday brunches, inviting veterans from around the area to gather, share stories, or simply enjoy fresh scones in silence. The bakery became something more than a business. It became a place of healing, a place where service wasn't something people tiptoed around, but something woven into the flour, into the walls, into the very rhythm of the work. And for the first time in years, Annie felt like she was more than just what had happened to her. She was building something, reclaiming something. One Friday afternoon, as the bakery wound down for the evening, Annie stood beside Daniel outside the shop. The air was warm, the sky painted in strokes of pink and gold. A soft breeze carried the scent of sugar and butter into the street. "You know," she said, crossing her arms, "I think I could get used to this." Daniel looked over, amused. "Took you long enough." Annie chuckled, low and real. "Shut up." They stood in silence, side by side, not needing to fill it with anything. "You never told me why you keep showing up," she said after a moment. He shrugged. "Because this place reminds me that not everything has to end broken. That people can start over. That scars aren't the whole story." Annie tilted her head toward him. "And me?" He smiled. "You remind me that strength doesn't have to be loud. It can be quiet, steady, like the best kind of fuse, the kind that holds everything together." The street light flicked on above them, casting a soft glow. Inside, Lisa turned out the front lights and locked the register. Kalila laughed in the back room, the sound drifting through the open window. The world went on, ordinary and beautiful. And in that moment, with her hand resting on the brass plaque beside the door and Daniel's presence beside her like a steady weight, Annie Garner finally let herself believe something she hadn't dared to say out loud in years. She was home, not just in a place, but in her own skin, and in this quiet corner of the world, where bread rose each morning and pain found its way into something warm and healing. She had built something no fire could take away. A life, a purpose, and peace.